Well, I'm excited. I'm very excited actually to propose a new path. Okay, let me explain that. I have been proposing a new way, but it hasn't been articulated really solidly. It's taken me a while. Can I just again open up to you and share what's happened for me? Because I used to be a teacher in first dimension, right? With second dimension inquiry. So that was my framework. And a lot of that fell away. So the idea that everything rises to awareness or that just resting as awareness is really the way because it reinforces repression and trauma. So you've heard me say all that, but I haven't articulated an affirmative path because I couldn't, because I was still in some way trying to accommodate the old way, meaning I knew that some people were coming in having spent time with teachers who were pointing in first dimension. They were doing mindfulness, meditation, resting as awareness. And I was trying to accommodate you all, which I still want to do. But in trying to do that, I was trying to be generous, like a teacher would be helpful. But in doing that, I've sacrificed a little bit of my own authenticity because that is not my path. So the path that I'm helping people with is not my experience, to be honest with you. The people that are coming in who really want to focus on resting and being. Well, I used to do that. And what I learned is that that was a bypass for me. And I've explained why. Just real quick, resting during a trigger might make you feel better or more peaceful. It doesn't get to the healing because there's a repression in it. And the repression creates the false identity in the trigger. So when you're upset, but you're an anger repressor, you're not going to be balls out angry. If you're a sadness repressor, when you're upset, you might get angrier than others might. So your repression is driving that, but it's not showing up. So just seeing that and resting during triggers is what I mean, reinforces the trauma. It doesn't get to it as far as I can see. No, it really doesn't actually. When I say as far as I can see, I was like, definitely in my own experience. But then when I look at others, it's the same. So what I'm saying is that there are problems with the existing paths. There are problems. We now know that if you go from the outside in, meaning if you rely on an authority to point you to awareness, and that's your main focus, well, enough of us have lived in this kind of teaching to know that that outside in leaves us unembodied. It doesn't get to the trauma and repression. And I may have to reach out to my more seasoned people out here who've been around maybe with my work for 10 or 20 years where you're going, yeah, I totally get that. Some of you may not really get that yet. I just need to talk to the people that get it first so we can create this path and then everybody else will come, or when whoever else is going to come, they'll come when they're ready. But I'm going to speak to you because you know what I mean. You know that the outside in, where it's like you're being pointed to recognize your true nature, or you're meditating or resting to recognize that. When I say it's outside in, it's like we're trying to recognize the space around in which everything happens. That, and then we go in to the embodiment. What I'm proposing this path is inside out so that it corrects the bypassing. So I've been trying to accommodate people with paths that are quite now opposite of mine. Their practices, they're coming in first dimension and holding tight to that. And I'm saying, come on, there's deeper work to do. And a lot of them are holding out and sending questions to me. I answer these questions on YouTube. Like, explain again how resting as awareness reinforces repression. So I answer those questions. But what I can see is I'm accommodating your path. What I need to do right now is create a new reality here, a new path, a new way. Because let me explain it this way. The outside in thing doesn't get embodied until the end. So the stuff in the body, the trauma and repression, it's running everything until you get to it. It's crazy. It's like the very place that we need to go first, which is the root of the suffering, we go to last. because it's held in the body. That seems ass backwards. And I think that explains why there's so much bypassing in spirituality. It's like we're all aware of it, but we really don't know why. It feels like that's part of it, that we're coming to the sort of like, I don't know, like meditation, mindfulness, being, resting. And that's like our way in, and we start there. Because of course we don't know. We don't know what we don't know. We don't know our own unconsciousness at that point. When we first start meditating or mindfulness, we're not embodied. We have no idea of the root of our suffering. So it's like we sort of clunkily, I don't know, is that the word? Uh, find it if we're lucky. So I almost had to die to find it. I had to almost kill myself over the seriousness of my pain in order to recognize, oh, there's actually something in here that I haven't gotten to. Why should people have to get to the end of their life or die or get sick or have major relationship issues before they recognize, oh, well, maybe we need to go to that first? It seems to me that this is like common sense. But so I'm going to articulate the path and I'm going to do it within 30 minutes. I promise this won't be a long video, but it's mainly because my husband's coming over and I'm spending the day with him. So I'm just going to start this today. Then I'm going to come back out. This literally has just come up for me the last few days. It's been forming. The map helped, obviously the map, but there was a missing piece. And that was, I think I was still trying to help many of you because you're like me. You're like reformed first dimension practitioners. So you come in with the awareness thing or presence, Eckhart, all that. And then I'm like, guess what? The root of our suffering is held in the body. And many of you knew that before you got here. It's to me, it's common sense, guys. Let's go inside out. That's the path. Of course, you can use KI any way you want. You don't have to follow listen to me, you don't have to follow my framework. You really don't. But this framework comes after years of experience as a teacher. And again, thousands upon thousands of one-on-one sessions. Every day of my life, basically, for the last 15 years, I've been in the consciousness of other people all over the world. This is what I'm seeing. So if you trust me in that regard, what I would do for anybody coming to KI is change the paradigm, change the context. From the beginning, here's what I'm proposing as the path, because I just think this is good for us. I think this is what's healthy. I think this is what brings intimacy and vulnerability. This is what makes us open up to our humanness and not try to transcend out of it. So from the beginning, can we say there's the non-dual and then there's the dual, and you don't have to fight between the two. They're just both here. The reason I say that is because frameworks don't really matter in terms of being ultimately true. They're just helpful. So if a framework isn't helpful, or if it leads us to bypassing, we need to change it. And I think the old paradigm, which is like this, everything's empty, the world is illusion. I think we've been putting the cart before the horse. So if we say from the beginning, no, our experience is, our framework is, there's the non-dual, we strive towards that recognition. We don't strive towards it, but it's kind of what the pursuit of awakening is about. But there's also the duality, and we just hold them together in the beginning because we don't want to exclude the duality. So what I've learned is that the older frameworks that try to bring in the absolute too soon, it programs us, some of us, in very, very subtle ways to avoid emotion. And I've seen it. Trust me, I don't want to go into all the anecdotal evidence, but there's tons of it. The way that we hear those pointers, because it's outside in, is that we're basically not wanting to feel something. So the pointers, we hear that from that conditioning. So that's another problem with the outside in, because in the body, even though there's no outside and inside, within the body, that's the core programming. It's creating all the effects. See? So when you start from the outside in, if you have a different framework too, so it's not just inside out, but it's different framework. I don't know if I'm being clear. The practice is inside out. The framework is it's both non-dual and dual. So here's what I mean. I'm simply correcting what I think is a framework that lends itself to bypassing. And the framework is trying to tell people the nature of reality before it's their direct experience. Sure, we'll have that, the non-dual as our part of our framework. But if we just say that, then subtly the mind and the body that wants to repress emotion will hear that and interpret that in some ways of denying and dismissing emotions or things in our human life. So if we start out from the beginning where we don't have to make a decision, we just have a framework and it's helpful. It doesn't have to be true. I don't think any words are true, but words that get close to a helpful framework for a practice would be there's both the non-dual and the dual. There's the one and the many. And if we see it that way, I think there's less chance for bypassing. Just get rid of the absolutistic language that I think people are believing and not necessarily experiencing directly. Of course, sometimes some of us come into direct experience. But there's a lot of people that are being programmed. So if we do it inside out, we don't get programmed. Here's what I mean. We don't get programmed by the spirituality. I think that the pointers and the practices will be more useful inside out. Because if you come, I've already started this path thing, explaining it. But basically I said, if somebody comes to spirituality or healing now, I would say, start the embodiment process from the beginning. Start inquiry, somatic inquiry from the beginning to get to the thing that's producing the shadows, the triggers, the chronic pain, all that. In other words, learn second and third dimension with first dimension, because it's probably going to end up there anyway. Because remember, the body keeps the score. So why not go to that first? Or not first, but in the beginning. You see how ass backwards that is? It's like we don't go to the root. We don't go to the engine driving all the suffering. We just rest here and see all the effects of it for years. Like, oh, this story, oh, that story, oh, this response, that reaction, that addiction, this disease, ooh, bad shoulder, effects everywhere, because we're doing it outside in. If we go inside out, we understand from the beginning where it's all coming from. We see that we have the repression of sadness, for example, because we go in the beginning, we start working with that. And so then it's no longer a mystery where the bypassing comes from. We're armed with insight that we never would have had from the outside in. Meaning, if you start with a body contraction that holds your childhood stuff and you start to open to that, not only will that embodiment be healthier, I think, because I think the embodiment is what heals disease or prevents it. It's just healthier, but it's also more helpful because as you meet these contractions, you're going to find that your repression of sadness is playing itself out in all these relationships, and the anger, repression, and the trauma. It's already playing itself out. See, when you go with the first dimension first and only, when you go from outside in, which is this first dimension, you don't see that. So again, it's a mystery for people for a long time what the real root of their suffering is, because they're going outside in. If I were to start back in 2004 with the fact that I had a heart that was contracted, I could have gone into that and potentially found deficiency stories and trauma and repression early on. And then it would not have been a surprise when I kept showing up as a people pleaser. See, because it was a surprise. I thought my people pleasing was just me being awake, like the kindness that is natural in presence. No, I was repressing anger. And I didn't know that for 15 years. So can you see why I'm proposing a switch, a 180? Because I think that this will correct the bypassing, guys. I am so excited about this, to know that finally things are starting to make sense. And it's just a 180 that we have to do. So let me talk about the logistics of that. So how do you start that? Or if you're already in the healing awakening path and you're interested in inside out, what changes would you need to do to bring that about? And by the way, if any of you are still think that outside in is the way, you have that right, of course. But I don't know that I'm going to accommodate that much anymore. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say, and it's going to trigger people sometimes. I'm going to say, if you're coming to me thinking that just resting is the answer, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring some inquiries to you if you're open and show you that the resting is it's a way of responding to trauma. It's a trauma response because there's no resting in liberation. There's no meditation really. It's just life. And so if we're doing something like resting, there must be an agenda. And if you haven't seen it, I'll show it to you. It's unconscious. And if you don't see that from the beginning, if you don't see that your resting as awareness comes from an agenda, in part to repress and suppress, then you'll just keep doing that for years and years. But if you do the inside out first, chances are that's something that we're going to talk about from the beginning. Is if you come to me and you say, from the beginning, because part of it is the awareness. So part of it would be resting, being, allowing, first dimension. But what people have done is they've come only within first dimension, sort of assuming that that's going to be the way. And I've accommodated a little bit too much. And what I want to do is I want to challenge you because I don't know that you're going to be able to come across the repression barrier if you keep putting your flag in the ground there and saying, first dimension, all the way. I'm not going to be mean about it, but I'm going to be clear and I'm going to be direct. And I'm going to be loving too at the same time. If you come to the meeting and you say, screw this inside out, I want to just wake up first. You have every right to do that. But what I'm going to do, because you come to the members area, is I'm going to, again, bring some inquiries into your experience, which will show you that there's an agenda there. Because there's no resting in liberation. There's an agenda to regulate there that's unconscious, to hold things back. And so, but if I can show it to you, then you might come into inside out. Because once I show it to you, I'm going to say to you, do you really want to spend the next 10 years with this hidden agenda to avoid something, but calling it awakeness, calling it embodiment? Because that's what's going to happen, is what I can see, is that if you just keep doing first dimension first, I can't see how you're going to get through that without a lot of effects coming up, a lot of suffering. It seems to me that if you'll go to the root of the suffering first, you will have to spend less time and energy working with the effects of that trauma, and plus a lot more insight from the beginning, because you're going to see what's happening in your relationships from the beginning. Not only the deficiency story and how it operates, but how the repression operates and triggers and in life and trauma from the beginning. I can't imagine that anybody wouldn't be attracted to that. But here's the logical or the logistical stuff. Not everybody can do repression work from the beginning or trauma work. So there'll be flexibility with that. That what I'm really encouraging is people to bring all the dimensions together as quickly as you can and have it all integrated. So from the very beginning, if you have difficulty with the third dimension work, you can still do first and second dimension practices that are relevant to trauma and repression. You can still do inside out. So for example, if somebody came with anger repression, driving all their suffering, and then they had a deficiency story that was an effect of that, like, I'm a loser, I'm a victim. Logistically, they might not be able to do the anger repression work at first. They might shut down, right? Because that's what their system is doing. So does that mean that they just abandon their dimension and go rest and be? Yes, that's what that means. But you would include second dimension there. So while you're resting, you would not turn away from the fact that resting often has an agenda. You would know that, and you would bring inquiry instead of just resting during triggers, for example, instead of just resting when you have chronic pain. which is a bypass, as I explained. Um, Instead of resting when you have shadows, you're going to do a little inquiry, second dimension style. So if you have anger repression, it might look like this. I can't do third dimension work, it's too much. But as I sit here resting as awareness, I know that the anger repression is creating this trigger with my mother. So I know it's anger repression because I'm doing inside out. See, I know from the beginning the root of my triggers, but I can't go straight to the repression work. So instead, I might say, I can say and do what I want to mom. And that starts the process of inquiry, but it's safer, seemingly, to the nervous system because you don't have to go straight into anger. It's safer, but it's still effective. And I gave you that inquiry in the recent video, which was, here's the key, now use it. And I'm going to take that video down. It may already be down by now, but I gave you this inquiry. I can say and do what I want because that's a soft entry point into the inside out path. And I do that purely out of love, give you that inquiry. And let me explain why. Because I, like you, spent years not understanding that I had conditioning from anger repression, which wouldn't allow me to really do and say what I wanted. I was at peace. The non-dual was direct in my experience, but the conditioning of that was in my body. And because I didn't do inside out, I didn't know. And as I look at you all not knowing that, and when I look at you triggered, when I look at you with pain, and I think you're doing outside in, so you don't know yet, and how long will it take you to know that your triggers are being directly influenced by the repression and your shadows and your pain, depression, and all that. So out of love, I say, I give you a soft entry into the inside out path. If you can't start third dimension early, go into, if you're an anger repressant, I can say and do what I want and live with that inquiry until your system softens to third dimension because you're going to want to go there. And then I gave sadness repressors a soft entry, if you notice. So I said, if you can't do third dimension work, or if you don't know how yet, and you want to do inside out because you don't want to spend 10 years blind to the root of your suffering, then start now. And an inquiry that I gave you would be, I'm not afraid to lose him. I'm not afraid to lose her. And then that will bring up a lot and it will activate the repression of sadness and hurt. You're going to feel that one. And I'll just say, sit with that mind and body, everything. Make sure you're saying mind and body. Take that with you. And that should bring you into third dimension work, like a soft landing right into it. So I think there's a place for everybody. Even if you can't do third dimension early, but you understand the wisdom of it. So if you can't do the practice, it doesn't mean you have to forget everything that I've said or that we know is true. Even if you can't do third dimension, you can still use the map. And I have to pull the map up at least once for this conversation. And guys, the reason that I'm talking fast is because my husband's coming over. I would like to give this subject a little bit more attention. So here's the map for all of us, a map of practice. And remember, this is actually mapping out what we're already doing. So I didn't create this out of the blue. This was from the 15 years of sitting with people all over the world and just trying to understand what was happening. So remember, first dimension is be with what is. You're not prompting anything up. That's what characterizes a first dimension pointer, practice, or teaching. Very powerful, actually. Also limiting because of the trauma and repression and the effects of it. So if you start, this is outside in right here. If you came to the awakening healing path awareness based and you're in first dimension only, you're doing outside in. It's just how I talk about it. You're going to the awareness, the meditation, the calm abidance kind of first. And then from that, you're noticing all the effects all the suffering that comes up, and then you're taught to just let that be, which is great, but a lot of your conditioning doesn't arise, right? So that's the stuff that you find at the end. The stuff that doesn't arise, the trauma programming, the repression, that's the stuff that we tend not to see until the embodiment phase. And yet it's driving all the effects here, or most of them. So when you're doing outside in, and you're setting in first dimension, even if you can't go down and do second or third, you still have this map. So you can have that as your framework. And I would just say then bring second dimension in with that. So I would think at the very least, if people are making KI their path, they're going to want to do first and second dimension together at least. Because with second dimension, you don't have to just sit there and watch the effects coming up, even though when you know that where it's coming from, you don't have to just sit there and keep avoiding things in your body. Because that's what tends to happen. I mean, obviously in first dimension, we can rest with a sensation. And if we're really quiet, even without prompting something up, some thoughts will come. So you're already investigating, some of you, a little bit of that mind-body connection around trauma and repression just in first dimension. But I think that many of you will see that, well, for example, I think a really good insight if you're doing this inside out is when you bring second dimension in, you're resting as awareness and you just bring that one inquiry in, which reverses the deficiency story. So that is, again, not something that you're going to hear on the outside in path because there's no prompting of anything. But if you include it, even when you're in first dimension, like you're sitting with a teacher who's outside in, which just means it's a teacher who focuses mainly on first dimension and maybe some second dimension. That's what that means. So you're sitting there with a person, and even though the teacher doesn't suggest prompting, you can learn KI and prompt so that as you're sitting there, you know there's trauma and repression. You've learned it. And so you know that when you're triggered by somebody, that's your repression and trauma driving it. Even if you can't do the third dimension skills yet, they're our best skills, you still know it. And so you can come to second dimension. And because you know it's driven by trauma and repression, you also know from KI that the trauma and repression, one of the effects of it is the deficiency story. So it's a different framework. When you're resting there in first dimension meditation and you get a sense of a deficiency story, if you don't prompt anything up, that deficiency story remains pretty unconscious because it's connected to the trauma and repression. It's the identity that got developed because you couldn't be yourself. So you can start discovering material around trauma and repression, even like if you're cheating, because your teacher's not pointing to it, doesn't mean that you can't explore it. See? So you're sitting there with Eckhart and he says, just rest and let that feeling be. But you know that there's a sense of deficiency there, an identity, but it isn't rising to awareness. And let's say you're sitting with Eckhart and you would love to do anger repression work because he doesn't talk about that, but you don't know how. But you do know, for example, that when he talks about the pain body, he's talking about that because you've been around KI to know that's the body. It keeps the score. And you know that connected to that sensation is a little story that you can't see. And then just a little bit of prompting, second dimension style, you can see it. So for example, you're sitting there and you pull your wife up, you do a boomerang. What deficiency story is coming up for me here? I'm unlovable. Then you reverse that. I'm totally lovable as you look at her. And here comes the conditioning that was hiding in the body that's trying to prove that identity of unlovable. And that's really connected to the trauma and repression. So you're already kind of working in that area from the beginning. Now, are you really working directly with the trauma and the repression when you're dealing with the deficiency story? Sort of and sort of not. Remember that when you are triggered, you're protected. So when you're upset with your wife, If you repress anger, chances are you're not balls out angry. Your system protects you from that emotion. So if you were only to process deficiency stories, you would be protected from feeling that emotion, which might sound safer, but it gets directly in the way of healing to be like that. So even though some of you will toy around with investigating second dimension inquiry with your teachers out there, I want you to also remember, as part of that framework, that one of my criticisms of non-dual teachings is how they focus on ego identity, like I am this or I am that, when to me, these are landing points because we can't feel and process emotions, because we can't be ourselves. Our system produces, I am a loser, I am unlovable, to protect us from feeling that repression. So that's something that you can know, even if you can't do third dimension work in the beginning, you can know that working with the deficiency story gets closer to it because it's so somatic that I'm not good enough. But you're also going to know it's not enough. And that's something, one of the brilliant things about a path is understanding the limitations of a practice or a pointer. And there's a limitation right there. The limitation is you're only seeing identity thoughts, and those are landing points because you don't want to feel something. So eventually, working in second dimension will take you to third dimension. It's exactly what I've been saying to you guys. In second dimension is where I gave you the inquiries in the video. Here's the key, now use it. So I gave you a few second dimension inquiries. They are, for anger repressors, I can say and do what I want. For sadness repressors, that's your primary. I'm not afraid to lose them. And another one was, I can be vulnerable with them. So you're already doing that. Those of you who are following along, you're already doing those inquiries. So you're already doing inside out. That's the good news. You're already doing it because you picked up those inquiries. You're already doing it. You're already including the trauma and repression conversation or that material. So there's not much you guys have to do. If you've been following along with me, just picking up those inquiries because they get to repression and trauma, you're not on the road to bypass it, in my view. But what about the people who, here's my last group of people. What about the people, I've met these folks. They're amazing. There are people that are coming into training with me who they don't want anything to do with first or second dimension. They've been there. They've seen the limitations. They're not happy. I'll just tell you, a lot of them, because what happens is they recognize, like I recognize, that first and second dimension is just like a resistance towards the inevitable opening to the woundedness that you don't want to feel. And so a lot of non-duality and Eastern practices are kind of one big attempt to not go there. But you can't see it when you're in it. You can only see it when you reverse the repression. And so these people are coming into training and they're going to third dimension first. And it's amazing to watch. But you have to understand that they've already done a lot of first and second dimension. So those folks they're doing what I did. They're having to do a cleanup job. There are some of us who didn't have the luxury of doing inside out. So we are doing cleanup jobs. A lot of the people in the members area are people who have bypassed for years in therapy and spirituality. They have to clean up the bypass because they did outside in. When you do inside out, you are dealing with that from the beginning. So it's not a cleanup job. It's a solid path, actually, that doesn't bypass. I'm jealous. I wish I would have had that path. But now I get to talk about and help other people with it. So is there a place for first and second dimension? So in other words, am I saying that everybody should just come in and do third dimension? It doesn't matter whether I say that. Not everybody will be able to do that. Some people will, and they'll come in and they'll just be on fire with it. And that's all I can say about it. They're ready for it. There'll be others who can't yet, but there's a place for you too. And for everybody, the awareness is all part of it. So where does the awareness piece fit in with inquiry on this new path? Um, because the old path started out with like it's all awareness or just pointing to awareness or calm abidance. We're not, we're going to do that here too, but not in a way that bypasses. So what I'll encourage you to do is rest and meditate and investigate your true nature a lot, but not during triggers. When you're triggered, when you have chronic pain, when it's a contraction running things, when it is shadows, and this is all you're suffering. So when it's depression, when it's anxiety, PTSD, OCD, all these real things that we deal with, inquiry, always, because that's our repression and trauma activated there. But so the resting and the pointing, I think, is better when we're not activated. Because when we're activated, when we're triggered, there's a repression thing that says, I don't want to feel this. And so I'm going to identify with a deficiency story. And then we might see the deficiency story and it falls away, but we still have this. I don't want to feel this. But it goes really quiet. This is why I'm saying don't rest during triggers, because it's a reinforcement of the whatever you're repressing. But there's a place for awareness from the beginning. And it would be in those sanitized environments, those safe, sanitized environments, which are good for pointing. Like mom's not here, dad's not here, wife is not here, kids are not here. Let's look, see things coming and going. Rest as what you are. Notice that what you are doesn't come and go. Now, but from there, you can't really apply that when you get off the mat or you go into an environment that doesn't feel safe, because when you don't feel safe is when you shut down and the triggers happen. And what doesn't feel safe is the primary repression, remember? That doesn't come up in the safe environment. It's really hard in first dimension to make somebody who represses anger bring anger up because mom's not there and dad's not there. So we use that mom and dad are not there or whoever else because it's safe and we can explore that without worrying about mom and dad or wife. But what I want to do is arm people so that when you get out of that safe and sanitized environment, you have skill to meet the repression and trauma in all these areas of life. And that's what makes it inside out, because you're working from the somatic body out, all your relationships, including your addictions. Here's another thing. Through the years, I just didn't understand. Why is everybody still addicted? Why am I still addicted? I mean, not to the drugs and alcohol, but to other things. Because of outside in. That's why. Because the real culprit is the repression and the trauma. But we're doing rest. Meanwhile, the culprit just keeps doing what it's doing. And it finds, if it quits alcohol, it picks up sugar. Outside in, bypass, outside in. Inside out scares people for one reason, I think. Well, a couple of reasons. They don't want to feel that, but that's just the repression, of course. You don't want to feel that. The other is I think people are concerned that they won't recognize their true nature in that. That's a red herring, because when you're processing trauma and repression, you're opening to that. It's the awareness that sees that. The energy is transmuting in the awareness. So when you're skillful in somatic work, the non-dual or the presence is very natural and obvious. It shows up without effort because you're actually processing the emotions that would make you effort to rest through that. In other words, the resting is repression. You just can't see it. But if you started processing during the triggers, for example, you wouldn't have to rest because the non-dual or the present shows up naturally when you meet what's there and it's unconscious. It's just natural. So yeah, awareness will be part of the path, but to me, it's overemphasized in the old path. It's way overemphasized. It's not natural or organic. It's recognition is effortless. It's just being. It's natural. It's a flow. So all those strategies in the old way are going to be looked at here all the strategies, because we need to go inside out. The strategies, resting is a strategy. Even meditation can be a strategy. Inquiry can be a strategy if you don't go to the repression. By strategy, I mean avoid, rest, void. See, I have pain, soothe it. Strategy to avoid the anger in that. Strategies. When you go inside out, you see the strategies from the beginning. You see that it's the sabotage is coming from the repression from the beginning. So therefore, you don't think that you're just sabotaging for no reason. You get the insight to see from the beginning, the reason I don't want to do KI is for one reason. I don't want to feel that. But you know that from the beginning. See, therefore it's harder to bypass. I think that's all that I want to say. My husband is going to pop in the door at any point in time here. This makes me happy, like joyous. Because it just makes sense now. All this just makes sense to me. Frankly, as a teacher, a lot of the suffering was really mysterious, and I was baffled by it. But with the map and the third dimension, it doesn't feel mysterious at all. It does if you go outside in, but inside out, it doesn't, because you know everything from the beginning. Even if you haven't transcended everything from the beginning, you have the insight that shows you why and how you're showing up in life from the beginning. And so other teachings might say, well, we talk about that too. It's ego from the beginning. Yes and no, of course, it's ego. But under the identity is an engine of unprocessed emotion, trauma. That's the thing that's getting missed. Even in the past that say that they're inside out, they start in a place that isn't embodied. They're still starting from identity. So what I'm going to invite people to do is start from somatic, inside out. Love you all. Come to the members area if you want to know more about this, but I'm going to do some more videos in the upcoming weeks to flesh this out a little bit more. Bye.